You're listening to the People Agenda podcast, brought to you by leading HR, workforce and payroll transformation specialist, Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to the latest People Agenda podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners. Thank you, as always, for joining us. And today we are going to be talking all things strategic workforce planning. In November, there was a conference which some of our team attended to, and I will introduce the team in a second. And it is the SWP Conference. It was on the 17th, 18th and 19th of November. And what I wanted to do is just spend 20, 30 minutes today picking the brains of those who went along. And last year we did a similar thing. I got one of the guests along. I say guests, but they're all lacers. I had one of our guests along. It was Nancy from our PWA team, just to talk a little bit around some of the interesting things that came out of it. And there was some really fascinating stuff. So we're going to build on that for this year, because as we were talking just before we went live, we've got some more interesting things. Now, of course, inevitably, there will probably be some kind of AI flavoured part of this conversation, but there's lots of other things that are a little bit different from last year. Let's kick off by saying hello to the trio, the fabulous trio. I will start with Nancy. How are you doing, Nancy? All right?
I'm good, thank you, Chris.
Looking forward to this?
Of course.
Always. Really interested to hear some of your reflections. And we've also got Joanna Clarke de Dromantin. Joanna, how are you doing? You all right?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks for butchering my name.
Yeah, I did a terrible job there. I do apologise. Joe, henceforth, always known as Joe. And finally, to complete the trio, it's Julian Holmes. How you doing, Julian? You all right?
Very well, thank you, Chris.
Didn't butcher your name. That's nice and easy for me. Right, guys, you all attended the SWP conference. And then also what we did in the evening is we had a lovely intimate roundtable dinner with a collection of senior professionals that are all strategic workforce planning specialists. And Julian, you went along to that as well. What I'd like to do is not only talk about the conference itself, but maybe if there's one or two discussion pieces that came out of that, it would be really interesting to kick it off. But before we do that, the tradition on this podcast is, of course, to ask you lovely people a fundamentally different question. That question, Julian, I'm picking on you first. Christmas. By the time we release this, it's going to be December. We're not quite in December at the time of recording. What is the first Christmas movie you have to watch when we hit December?
Judge me, but Elf. I do really like Elf. I think it's a feel-good movie, very silly. But actually, I was at the end of the Formula One or before the Formula One on Sunday, I also caught a little bit of The Gruffalo's Child, which made me cry because it made me remember my when my little kids used to sit down and watch those things with me. So there you go.
Ah, that's a very sweet one. Joe, do you have one that you wish to enlighten our wonderful listeners?
I really like watching The Grinch, but that's only because I love Benedict Cumberbatch.
Not Jim Carrey.
It's Benedict that does it for me.
It's the Benedict, right? It's the Benedict show. Fine. Nancy, are you a Grinch or are you something else?
My favourite one of all time would be Muppet Christmas Carol. I watch it every year. Absolutely love it. I will die on the hill that Michael Caine deserved an Oscar for his performance.
Yeah, it was brilliant. I have to say, I prefer watching the Disney's Christmas Carol one, the animated one with Jim Carrey. But you're all wrong. The answer is, in fact, Home Alone 2. That is the tradition in my household. And not Home Alone 1. It has to be Home Alone 2. Don't ask me why. Maybe it's just because as a kid, always wanted to visit New York. And that was a very magical movie to get me interested in it. But we're not here to talk about Christmas movies. We are here to talk about the SWP conference. I just really want to kick off, Nancy, with a bit of an overview as to some of the interesting topics that you found came out from this year, perhaps that are a little bit different from last year. I talked about AI. Inevitably, that's going to be a conversation piece. It's a conversation piece wherever we go. It's a conversation piece in the news to chief people officers, for all people that work across all different types of business and how it's impacting the way work is done. But I don't know if you can pick out a reflection that you'd just like to share with our listeners that you thought was particularly interesting from the day. And then, Joe, you can build on that. Any thoughts on some of the bits that Nancy talks about?
Yeah, I think the key one that struck me was from a presentation by Talent Neuron, and they spoke about the idea of work architecture, which is building on the common idea of job architecture and I guess taking it a step further. So rather than just thinking about job redesign, role and skill redesign, it's also just looking at taking more of a task-based approach. So thinking about how work gets done, how that is going to evolve. Obviously, there's an AI angle there in terms of agents and automation. And in order to actually do that properly, you need that kind of task level clarity rather than role level clarity. And most organizations don't seem to be there yet. So I think that's a huge opportunity for organizations to start thinking about how they could go about that, what data they would need, what tools they have to start to answer some of those questions and put themselves in that position. I think the external context for that, obviously there's this idea of constant change, which I think most organizations are starting to wake up to a little bit. And I think when you start to think about concepts like reskilling, having to constantly evolve and reskill, then taking that task-based approach makes a lot more sense.
Joe, any kind of build on that? It's an interesting one, that this task, as Nancy said, the task level clarity versus role level clarity. But any thoughts on, because to me that all feels very kind of meta, this sort of high thinking type thing. How many businesses, as Nancy just hinted on, are actually looking at this and going into the practical level? I don't know how much practicality there was, but again, I wasn't there. So I'd be interested to get your reflections.
I think quite a lot of organizations are, if they're not thinking about this practically yet, will very soon, just because AI is on the top of everyone's list of how to do that. And one key thing is you automate a task, you don't automate a role. So if we take that as the baseline, then the next thing is that if you want to increase your usage of AI and plan for AI in the future, you're almost forced to think of your work in terms of task. And something else that came out through actually various different conversations, it wasn't just one speaker, it was that how do we actually view the organization? So the traditional one, I'm sure a lot of the listeners will have heard job architecture and will have seen multiple different versions of a job architecture. But it's this idea of, if we go down the route of task ontology and thinking of task architecture, then we're really asking ourselves, what should that future organization or the organization we're currently in, how should we organize it? How should we view it? How should we discuss it? So not just in terms of HR, which would be the job architecture, and you have your org hierarchies, your spans and layers, and all this other HR jargon, but you also have finance. And finance views the organization in terms of a cost center. So they would budget for the organization using that structure. And the answer might not be switching to the finance structure. It might just be within the middle. And that is that task architecture, which then brings that next question of how do you cost for task? So that's really where I think SWP can be quite exciting, because it's not just how do we plan for a future workforce. It brings in all these other elements of OD, of thinking about how do we actually view the organization? How are we going to put a structure that is fit for the future and can take in AI as well? So in my opinion, it doesn't necessarily sit with HR anymore. It doesn't sit with finance. It sits as its own. But I'm sure my colleagues might have a different opinion on that. But because we're also bringing in ops to that as well, because as HR, you wouldn't know what that task is. It's too much in the detail, and finance wouldn't know what that task is. You really need to have someone on the ground from the business in that conversation as well. So you're starting to, I'm sure you can see this grow now. You have HR, finance, and ops involved already, which is quite a unique position to be in.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Julian, I see some smiling there, so I don't know if you want to build on that, but particularly maybe also reflect on, just before we went live, you were talking about the different ways, different models of SWP, the way people view SWP, and Joe talking about this mindset of moving it away from HR and finance. So any kind of thoughts around that, and maybe some reflections from the dinner that you were at of the evening of the conference?
I think there was a lot of process-driven, cost-driven. SWP was a real focus, and therefore tying in with finance and tying with the financial planning process was super important. I think that also you sometimes saw organizations who would go down long-term strategic workforce planning, really trying to think about strategic talent issues. I think one of the things that came out of the conference, and I've got a bias in here, which is really people starting to use SWP to focus on addressing real business problems, like things that would actually drive the performance of the business or position the business strategically to actually remain competitive and remain relevant. And so there was certainly, in terms of what Joe is talking about, this idea that you start to think about SWP much more holistically in terms of what's the business impact of the business decisions we need to make. How do people and workforce impact those decisions? Absolutely how AI is potentially going to transform certainly some types of work and certainly some types of roles. So how do you begin to understand that? How do you begin to model it? But then I think also you're beginning to see the discipline of SWP become merged with other related disciplines, things around organization design, people analytics, talent analytics, and synthesizing those things together to where really it's really the role of HR as a strategic advisor and shaper to the business. And I'm contractually obliged to say one of the things that came out in our recent piece of research on proactive people transformation is really all about, one of the key themes in that is really like SWP has been a very important lever for CPOs and people functions who want to engage in how you solve real business problems.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to stick with you, Julian, on this, and then bring Nancy in, and then Joe, any sort of builds that you want to have about that, because one of the bits in the conference that talked about was being able to answer the questions that the CEO is asking, and how do you actually influence business. We're going to be a little bit cheeky, listener, because we're going to obviously build in and tell you about our white paper, which is called From Implementer to Influencer, Redefining HR's Role in Business Transformation. And in that, we spoke to a number of CPOs, COOs, CTOs, and also CEOs as well. And we looked at that nature and the relationship between the CPO and the rest of the C-suite. How, obviously, this is in the context, Julian, of strategic workforce planning and then the conference itself. Can you reflect a little bit on how potentially that is evolving, how that's changing, how the CPO's role, or even just HR's role, is evolving? Did you get much of that from the conference perspective, or even if not in the conference perspective, when you have spoken to people at the roundtables, or when you just go out and meet some of our clients as well, or some of our friends that we have at Lace, like that evolving role of the CPO, and then leveraging something like SWP to be able to answer the CEO's questions?
I think there's a range of approaches. There are different clients, different businesses with different perspectives on these questions. I'd always say that the approach you choose to take in SWP is very context driven. Sometimes you're trying to solve problems over specialist skills. Sometimes you're trying to solve problems around where is it that the work needs to be done, what's the most economic location for the work. So there's a whole variety. So I'd never say there's one size fits all for SWP. That said, I think that one of the mistakes that people make is that they assume that they need to go in at any particular entry point. So they need to go into the cost entry point, or they need to go into the sort of high level strategic thinking. And I think therefore doing a piece of foundational work to actually say, if we're going to invest all this time and effort, and everybody on this call is involved in some significant SWP projects at the moment, is just being really clear about what's the purpose, what are we trying to achieve. And I think therefore the biggest problem is you want to make sure that anything that HR does, anything you do to do with people, is investable and is relevant to the business, which is why I think it's so important for me, usually the best answer is to try and find a business problem that needs to be solved and tackle it there. I think in the dinner that we held, most of the people at that dinner, we had a few people who were taking more of a process-based approach, more of a cost-based approach. It's not that was wrong. That was in the context of their business, the problem they felt they needed to solve as a priority, and that's understandable. But there was certainly other people at the dinner who were starting to say, actually, to be honest with you, a lot of the SWP we do now is alongside business evolution, business transformation. As I've already said, where should we be locating our work? What's the impact of AI on our work? How do we think about our business model as we have political and regulatory change, some of the challenges to globalization at the moment? So it all depends. What business are you in? What's the business context? What are the problems you're trying to solve? What are the opportunities? And I think for example, we had a brief, but still a really interesting conversation about, we tend to focus on costs in SWP, but how powerful it can be if you start modeling value. How much value do different members of your workforce produce? How do you begin to measure that? And how do you demonstrate that making the right workforce decisions can actually actually not only, shall we say, help you avoid unnecessary costs, but also can start driving top line value, top line revenue, and top line margin and EBITDA for the business.
Nancy, I want to get you in on this because I'm quite interested about this. And there was a couple of sessions, one called Forecast to Action, influencing the business. And we've talked about the strategic workforce planning, answering the questions that every CEO is asking. So was that a common sort of thread throughout the days? It feels like AI is mentioned a lot, inevitably, but was this idea of the importance and the value of linking a lot of this stuff to driving business outcomes? Is that something you got quite a lot of? And I just want to get any reflections from you from some of the sessions that you heard.
Yeah, I think there was a lot around positioning HR as being within the business rather than adjacent to it, and just being brought in when there is a people element of a conversation, whatever level that may be. I think HR should be in discussions around technology, around productivity, around redesign, whatever that is, not just because there is a people angle, but because there is that understanding that people impact workforce. And that kind of has a knock-on effect on a lot of the pillars of SWP. Joe made the point around finance and finance having to think differently earlier. Again, if HR isn't seen as that strategic advisor and operating in that sort of shaping space, then those conversations get a lot harder, because the idea of, say, work architecture or work redesign is less likely to succeed because you don't have that leverage, for example. So I think there are a lot of sessions that reflected that. I think the idea, or who was that? I think Novartis spoke about recent World Economic Forum report around CEO or CPO priorities. So talking about, again, it's linking back to AI, but some of the sort of top priorities for CPOs were around understanding kind of how work should get redesigned, understanding that sort of agent versus human split between tasks, etc. So if you're not in those conversations and operating at that right level, then you're not going to make the right decisions for the business and have that business impact.
Joe, do you want to build on that? I'm going to, just to tee you guys up, I probably want to just touch on if there's anything else from the AI side that we haven't talked about so far. But Joe, if you want to build on what Nancy was just talking about there.
No, just listening to Julian and Nancy, I think one of the key things that struck me from all of the conversations is that the questions that CEOs are asking are getting tougher. The answers that they need to get them quicker. And so I think a lot of the conference, if we think about it, is how can HR, and that was at least most of the practitioners attending, how can they build that muscle to proactively be able to answer these questions at speed? I think that's the bottom line of all of it, because the questions that we hear CEOs asking is, how is automation going to change our workforce composition next year? Not in 5 years, it's next year. At the beginning of this year, we didn't even think about ChatGPT, and I think now everyone's using it in every capacity. Then the next level down is, will we have the skills and capabilities to deliver on the strategies? These are not questions, again, that are happening in the future. They're happening now. So I think that's the wake-up call, is the questions are only going to get more difficult, and HR just needs to be set up to have that. And so we need to build up that data foundation to have access to be able to answer those questions, as well as be able to model it. And SWP is a way that you can model some of those questions.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, then none of these questions, they're both getting harder, but there's also not a simplistic answer to them. So I think organizations need to get used to the fact that you're not necessarily going to get a straightforward sense of direction from doing the work. At its best, SWP is still going to be an imperfect discipline, because you're working on assumptions and you're looking longer term, and data is only ever going to be sort of your best guess at a point in time about how things are going to go. It's never actually going to play out exactly as you think it's going to play out. So getting leaders and stakeholders aligned to that idea of best guesses and sort of data reality, not data perfection, is really important as well, particularly as the stuff that organizations are having to grapple with is getting more complex.
Yeah, and you said something, Nancy, just before we went live, so I just want you to jump on that as well. And then Julian, if you want to build on any of it, which is this idea of organizations are in, you use the word permacrisis, and so there's constant change. So could you just elaborate that in a far more eloquent way than I ever could?
So a couple of stats we were given were that 96% of organizations have had a major disruption in the past 2 years. So rather than thinking about a big event that might happen, then you really need to be agile and be flexible and ready to respond to anything, whether that's a pandemic, other macroeconomic events, etc. The other quite scary stat was that 2/3 of the workforce are going to need substantial upskilling just to keep up with the pace of change that we're seeing in organisations at the moment. And of that, 1/3 are going to need it just to stay in their current role. So that really puts a very different and quite urgent perspective on the entire resourcing, talent, L&D conversations that organisations are having. And again, that's not just within HR, it's reflecting on the wider business as well. Exactly.
Julian, I feel like I've heard you say this many times when we were in the process of writing the white paper, and even before we did that, around this idea that change or transformation is BAU. So do you want to just reflect on some thoughts there? Because I know you've definitely got a soapbox for that.
I'm sure I've got a soapbox. I think it's just an observation. And in fact, this is coming out loud and clear from all the conversations we've had. I think there's a sort of a mistrust, or even a kind of almost a rejection of where organizations would have been 5 or 10 years ago, where they would do a major transformation program every few years and then they would stop and try and embed it until the next crisis came along. I think many businesses are now trying to move to a much more evolutionary approach to not only how they evolve their people and organization, but also the rest of their business model, how they work with customers and so on. So I think it just accepting the fact that the idea that somehow you'll have a period of zero change or no change, it just isn't realistic in today's world. And that drives a lot of questions in terms of how prepared are we as a business, both in terms of tools, skill set, data, you name it. And I think probably the most important one is leadership and manager capability to go on those journeys. And it's a real challenge for many clients where they, for example, they find that they've got a management team who are extremely well suited to when they're in high growth. But then when that growth tails off, when market conditions get more tricky, is perhaps sometimes they find that they don't have the right mechanisms, the right bureaucracy, the right leadership to help them through that more tricky period when it's not just about how quickly can we grow, but how do we consolidate? How do we make sure we're really adding value for our customers, retain the customers we've got, and then be ready for when that market picks up.
Yeah, and the organizations, we deal with large organizations, 5, 10,000, 100,000 employees plus. When you're thinking about those and all of that line manager community, and then bringing so many people and the complexity about bringing so many people along on that journey, it's something certainly organizations need to be thinking about. What we're talking, you're obviously mentioning about that management team that might sit at the top of the C-suite, but also then you've got those layers down below as well. We've got a couple more minutes left, and I just wanted to give you all a little bit of a free swim really for our final few minutes. Is there anything, I'll start with you, Joe, and then Nancy and Julian to wrap us up. Is there anything from the conference or any other bits that you wanted to pick up that you just thought were particularly interesting from any of the conversations you have? Maybe anything that we might not have covered already?
I think something that we didn't go into too much detail, but it's, first off, let's start off with, we've said many scary things, but just don't overcomplicate SWP as well. Keep it simple, and a start is better than no start. But then also it's don't only plan for the workforce that you can see. So there's a lot of workforce that is, I wouldn't say hidden because they're there, no one's trying to hide them. But what that means is essentially it is the bots, or it is the automation, it is the agents, but it is also the contract workers. So for instance, it's not just about planning for your FTE or your full-time workers. It's about thinking, what do we define as the workforce? And then linking that back what we said earlier, what are the tasks that are being done in the organization, and not what are the roles that we're paying for? I think that would be the one thing that I think is worth exploring as well. Nancy,
final thoughts or anything we missed?
So one thing that really struck me was the idea of DEI considerations on, I guess, both task and work redesign and upskilling as well. So I think applying that lens to both of those approaches is going to become more and more important. And I think there's a danger in kind of just focusing on the financial implications, financial scenario modeling, but you also need to bring that lens to it as well. So I think there are potential risks around creating sort of elite groups who have access to upskilling at the expense of others, making sure that, say, mid-career or older workforce benefit as well. And there are huge consequences, I guess, from that sort of work flexibility perspective as well, when you're going in with that task and work architecture approach.
I think that's a really fascinating and important point to note out, actually, those different employee demographics and understanding the differences and the different requirements that they need and the different opportunities to grant them as well. Julian, just last but certainly by no means least, sir, any kind of final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I suppose it's a general one, which is when I think about our clients and I think about, mostly spent time in finance and strategy before I started doing this people stuff, is I think one of the primary gaps that people functions have is around the ability to model things, to start thinking about what would the future might look like and what are some assumptions can we make and what would be the implications of those assumptions, and to be able to use data, not just to report or just to act as a steward or tell people where they are, but to start to use that data to start modeling and tell them what the future might look like. And I just think that's such a important skill set. Not every HR team will either have that capability or find it particularly easy to grow. So that might mean you need to partner with other parts of the business that have got that modeling capability and start to make sure that whole sort of, whether it's the EDI things that Nancy is mentioning, whether it's some of the changes of work that Joe has been talking about, is the ability to start to model that and start turning that into real numbers so that business leaders can start to say, okay, I can see now why my people and workforce decisions are going to impact what kind of business results I get. And the more that HR or people functions can help shape that conversation, I think that will be very productive.
Yeah, I really love that as a kind of bookend to today's podcast, which we are out of time on. Julian, thank you very much for 30 minutes of your time today, sir.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, Joe, always a pleasure. And I will never say your surname ever again for fear of you absolutely lambasting me, but it's been lovely having you on.
Thank you for having me.
And Nancy, finally, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Been really good. Hopefully you've enjoyed this as much as the guys and I have enjoyed recording it. If you want to get in contact with them, you can check all of them out on LinkedIn, or you can go onto Lace Partners website and you can connect with Julian, Joe and Nancy via the contact button or on their profiles as well. If you want to subscribe and do all of that good stuff for this podcast, we would be very much obliged and thankful for your subscription. But from myself, from Julian, from Joe and from Nancy, thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the People Agenda podcast. Bye-bye.